Exorcist II: The Heretic, released 4 years after the original movie in 1977. There was a chaotic production behind this one. William Friedkin declined to return as director. John Boorman, director of Point Blank, Deliverance, and Zardoz, took his place. Most of the cast, aside from Linda Blair and Max von Sydow, refused to participate. And the film is not based on any source material from author William Peter Blatty, and he was not involved at all in the making of the sequel. Taking place a few years after the events of the film, we find Regan, again played by Linda Blair, has for some reason been abandoned by her once devoted mom and left in the care of doctors at some kind of high-tech psychiatric facility where they perform synchronized hypnosis and the doors slide open automatically like in Star Trek. Another priest, Father Lamont, played by Richard Burton, is pulled into Regan's orbit as she begins to explore suppressed memories of her exorcism with a psychiatric professional played by Louise Fletcher, fresh off her Oscar win for One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Discovering that Regan's experience with demonic possession may not be entirely over, Father Lamont realizes through bizarre visions that he must travel to Africa to track down a man with special powers, Kokomo, played by James Earl Jones, who was saved from... I gotta take a second there. All right. Kokomo, played by James Earl Jones, who was saved from a similar possession as a boy by Father Marin, Max von Sydow's character. These events are somehow meant to connect with locust swarms and New Age ideas about psychic links between minds. As is characteristic for nearly all of the Exorcist sequels to come, The Heretic was plagued by many production difficulties, most well known of which being the extensive rewrites that occurred over the course of the film's production, which resulted in the actors gradually losing faith in the project and the story becoming less and less coherent. The movie is generally regarded as a massive disappointment, sometimes referred to as one of the worst movies ever made. It was a critical failure, though a minor box office success. Regardless, it basically killed the burgeoning Exorcist franchise for many years to come. So that's what the general consensus is that this is a bad movie. But, we're coming at this from more of a personal angle here. So I ask you, DisRegarding Henry, what are your thoughts on The Exorcist II? How do you feel about it?
I'll say right off the bat, I went in with an open mind. I was not expecting it to match the original. I mean, how could it? I was just hoping that it would do something interesting of its own. And even with those tempered expectations, I don't think it even lived up to that. Almost immediately, you can tell this film is not going to have the same sense of realism as the first movie. That psychiatric facility, which is the main setting pretty much, is just silly. The synchronizer machine, which is this little machine that flashes lights at people and makes this little beep, beep, beep to synchronize brain waves or something. This is actually what kicks off the plot and starts the horror, if you can call it that, in this movie. It is also very silly. Within the first 10-20 minutes, I'm thinking okay, this isn't going to be like the first movie. This isn't going to be realistic or frightening, so I'll try to enjoy it as camp. And I did, actually, for a bit. Not long after that, the movie really started losing me. I couldn't follow the plot. I couldn't follow the motivations of the characters. And I didn't feel that Regan was in any kind of real danger this time around. I didn't even understand what the actual threat was most of the time. I did get that Regan has these repressed memories. The demon still seems to be present in some way, but she really seems to have it under control. I never got the sense that she was at risk of being possessed again or anything. So I could not fathom what was driving the story. It all just seemed unnecessary to me.
The way you said you had to reframe your mindset about what you were about to watch and the kind of movie you were watching, that's what I had to do as well. I think as you mentioned, very quickly you start to realize, okay, this isn't really going to match the quality of the first movie, but I don't think that's a reason to completely discount it. I found the way I had to watch it was kind of as a almost like an Italian supernatural thriller in the vein of like a Dario Argento movie, where
Okay.
you don't really operate on logic. You're not really operating on the story so much, and with it making sense. You're kind of just going through the vibe of it. And I think there's some good vibey moments to this movie. You mentioned that that opening mind sync thing, which is silly to talk about, but I think it actually is an effective scene because of what it does with sound. I really like the way that the tone of this machine gradually lowers. It does actually, it worked for me to actually put me in this kind of relaxed, semi-hypnotized state to where once these visions of this demon that lies dormant in Reagan start to present themselves, and it's almost seeming like she's interacting with the people who are actually in the room, like holding hands with somebody in the room.
Yes.
I thought
Yeah.
that was actually pretty well done. I thought that was really enticing to see. Okay, how's this gonna go if we're blending the reality of what's in our brains with the physical reality? That's an interesting idea. It doesn't really fulfill that promise of that idea. It kind of goes in a bunch of other directions. But I think this is more a movie to watch scene to scene, and take things that you like about it and then sort of accept that maybe it's not going to make a whole lot of sense and you're not going to have a sense of being moved in the way that you are the first movie. But I think one of the things that really saves the movie for me and kind of gives it a context is Ennio Morricone's score. There's moments
Oh, okay.
of Linda Blair on that roof of her, like this very modern apartment that she resides in, where her dress is blowing in the wind and there's this kind of beautiful melodic haunting score, and you're just kind of looking at it and you're looking at this image, and it just popped in my head really. I'm just like, wow, that's, if you just took that image outside and this sort of feeling outside of this movie, it has impact. It's beautiful in its own way. And there's actually moments in this movie I think are pretty outstanding visually and auditorily, but as something that's cohesive, that actually carries you through a story, that makes you feel the emotions, I did not experience that for personally. I was just the same as you, pretty baffled by all the story directions. And after it was over, I kind of shrugged my shoulders and just said, okay, it is what it is, and just kind of moved on, which I think is what most people did really, because it's sort of it came and went. It's not really a movie that's talked about outside of being this strange sequel to this classic movie. It doesn't really have too much discussion happening around it these days.
Actually, believe it or not, a track from this movie, this score, was actually used in Quentin Tarantino's The Hateful Eight for a sequence in that one. Of
I didn't
almost
know.
unlikely connections. Yeah, Tarantino actually sampled the score in Hateful Eight.
So Tarantino gets it. He saw those moments of like, oh, there's something there that most people probably didn't.
I see what you're saying, and I think you're making some interesting points that I hadn't really thought about. And I actually do agree with you. Like, there are isolated moments because John Boorman is a gifted director, and he's made a lot of good, great, and even interesting movies. Like Zardoz it's typically called one of the worst films ever made too, but that's a much more interesting movie than it's given credit for. Again, a mixed bag, kind of incomprehensible, but interesting nonetheless. I gotta say though, the really big thing that I think kind of sunk this for me was the sequences set in Africa. That's like probably a full half of the movie, and that just did not work for me. I think it was trying to develop the first film's ideas of ancient evil and primeval forces, but it was really just dull. And I think the reason it's dull is because it's not convincing. The first film is really convincing. Even the long, drawn-out prologue, you're in a real place. There is an atmosphere to it, and I think that's why it holds your attention. In this one, I mean, it looks like we're on a set single second, and we are. So we never buy into any kind of reality, or at least I didn't. There was really no atmosphere for me. There was no tension, and worst of all, as we've been saying, there's no clarity. So, I mean, as Father Lamont's trying to find this guy Kokumo, Ferns brings up in the chat, dear sweet Kokumo, Aruba, Jamaica, ooh, I want to take ya.
The song was playing constantly in my head every time they said his name.
But again, that whole section of the movie, I did not really fathom what was motivating it.
I also like that Reagan obviously demonstrates this ability to like cure people of their ailments.
Yeah.
And then the psychiatrist just brushes it off, like, don't talk to anybody, like, don't do that. That's like
oh yeah, they had a really interesting interpretation of what they thought an autistic kid was.
Yeah.
Yeah, that poor little girl.
It was like something out of Mask.
That was so bizarre. And like, so I mean, that doesn't pay off. Like, that's she demonstrates like, oh, okay, like she has this almost like healer ability, and it doesn't go anywhere. It's something that they just show happen.
Pazuzu? Is Pazuzu healing it?
I guess it could be. I guess it's food for thought there.
But I didn't even understand really like Kokumo's role in any of this. Like, I get like why he was set up into the story, but what was he supposed to do? He didn't seem to do anything. Again, that was another thing that just didn't seem to pay off. He just seems to be dropped from the story at a certain point, as far as I could tell. He introduces like these concepts of like talking about the locust swarms and this thing, the brushing of the wings, which is apparently a phenomena where locusts are sent into a kind of frenzy. And I think it's meant to be connected with this idea that the demon leaving a mark on all whom it comes into contact with. So I guess maybe that makes them vulnerable to a kind of suggestion, which maybe makes them a threat. But again, to whom and exactly why, I never really knew. So I really couldn't make sense of any of it, which really blocked me from ever getting involved in it in any kind of way.
I think to really compare the two, it's interesting because previously with The Exorcist, the first one, we were praising that it sort of generates mystery in its opening act. It doesn't really tell you concretely what this demon is, where it comes from. We just know that it has this presence, and we know that Father Marin has been obviously pursuing it and following it wherever it goes, and obviously exorcising it from its hosts. But that mystery, that the fact that it doesn't really tell you concretely that's what it is, I think makes it very interesting, but it's compelling nonetheless because it's distilled down to a human story. It's distilled down to it happening to a mother and her daughter. And even the priest, Father Karras, he's struggling with his own demons, and he's we get caught up in those aspects outside of the supernatural things that are happening. They're a little bit loosey-goosey. This one, it's pretty much about those forces, those phenomena that the movie doesn't really explain either. It's also very mysterious and vague, but because that puts so much emphasis on it, I think it becomes pretty isolating pretty quickly, and that there's not a compelling human story to reel you in and to make you want to go deeper into those questions. Father Lamont is a much more cold character than Father Karras. He's pretty much focused on his mission, and he doesn't really allow you into what he's thinking and feeling. He's a much darker character. He goes through kind of a change himself of allowing Pazuzu to kind of enter him, from what I interpreted. I think for some of the images it does conjure for this kind of mysterious, vague evil, there's some good stuff. Like I actually really liked the idea of the locusts and how that was all done, because that it obviously has biblical allegory with the swarm of locusts and the famine that brings, and the sickness that is also associated with this giant swarm. But I like that was a different interpretation of how evil could manifest than what we had seen in the first film. I like that Boorman tried to come up with a visual image that would distinguish this one from the first movie. We do see possessed Reagan again, and it doesn't have as much impact, frankly. But I think this movie actually does have some compelling images based on that idea of evil manifesting in something else, and not just one being, but many beings, many smaller beings that in their path create destruction and hunger and sickness. And I thought that was very interesting. I thought that was an interesting direction to take it, especially how it comes back when they revisit the home. That actually really took me by surprise when Father Lamont opens the door, and spoiler, Father Lamont opens the door to Reagan's room, and it's just locusts just pouring out in these crazy huge numbers. And it's a bit of a shock. And that was maybe the only moment that I actually was kind of affected by, in terms of it being a thrilling moment. I'll defend it in that regard of it being distinct, but I can't really argue with it coming together and being cohesive and being affecting and a coherent movie. But there's definitely things you can pick out that I appreciated, that I liked that Boorman brought to it, his unique vision about the material and the nature of evil.
I agree. There are isolated things you can pick out that you can enjoy or appreciate, but bottom line, I mean, you really do want an Exorcist movie to be scary. And I didn't think this one was scary. And when a horror movie isn't scary, you hope at least it can be funny or entertaining in some other way. And this one does have its funny moments, not always intentionally, I don't think. Often not intentionally, I don't think. Like, I really laughed at the end when Regan saves the day with what I know is supposed to be something else, but to me, it just looked like this disco move. I thought it would have been so great if she broke out into like a John Travolta dance routine at that moment.
Morricone let down the score there. They should have had a strong disco beat by the Bee Gees there.
Aside from a few moments like that, I didn't think it was especially funny either. But still, I would have been willing to forgive that. I would have been willing to forgive a lot if it could have involved me in some way. But it really didn't. I couldn't follow it, couldn't understand the characters. I never grew to care for anyone, and so I never really got invested in anything. I didn't mind so much that it wasn't like the original, but I did mind that it didn't invest me, and I think ultimately that makes it a failure for me in my book.
Yeah, I'm not going to passionately defend it. So there's a few things I appreciated about it. I don't think it's the worst movie ever made. I think that's hyperbole. I think in comparison to the first one, it's definitely a letdown, but I think it kind of stands more as an interesting artifact, kind of almost a psychedelic reinterpretation of the story that may be of interest to some people. And I know it does have its fans.